welcome to When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, the films that shaped the MTV generation. You know one thing that united all of us Gen X babies? Crippling anxiety about the looming threat of nuclear war. 1983's WarGames skillfully gave a voice to that fear. WarGames was directed by John Badham, director of Saturday Night Fever, who replaced Scent of a Woman director Martin Brest, who was fired by producers after filming had already begun. It was written by Lawrence Lasker and Walter H. Parks, who received an Academy Award nomination for their script, and it is one heck of a gripping film about a pair of adorable nitwits who almost start World War III. WarGames opens with a pair of Air Force servicemen showing up for their shift manning the launch controls at a missile silo in an unidentified location. The servicemen are named Jerry and Steve, and they are played, respectively, by the late and much-missed West Wing star John Spencer and by Reservoir Dogs star Michael Madsen. Shortly after starting their shift, they're given authenticated orders to launch the missiles. Jerry hesitates before dooming millions of people to certain death, and Steve eventually has to aim his gun at him to get him to turn his launch key. Luckily for the world, this turns out to be just a drill. 22% of all controllers responded like Jerry and refused to launch their missiles. At the Cheyenne Mountain Complex headquarters of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, a top-level engineer named John McKittrick explains to various high-ranking government officials, as well as to General Behringer, the officer in charge of NORAD, that he's deemed it best to take humans out of the equation when it comes to launching nuclear missiles. He wants to transfer launch capabilities to NORAD's high-powered War Operation Plan Response Computer, known as WOPR. McKittrick is played by 1980s film mainstay Dabney Coleman of 9 to 5 and Cloak and Dagger. Behringer is played by popular character actor Barry Corbin, perhaps best known for the CBS series Northern Exposure. Obviously, filming at NORAD would have presented challenges because the real-life Cheyenne Mountain Complex is known as the most secure facility in the world. So WarGames designed its version of NORAD from scratch, and it did a bang-up job of designing a facility that looks very high-tech and top secret. Meanwhile, in peaceful Seattle, Washington, a high school kid named David Lightman is late for class because he's busy playing Galaga at a local arcade. The role of David Lightman, who is loosely based on real-life hacker David Scott Lewis, is played by Matthew Broderick, then already a Broadway star, in one of his earliest screen roles. The role of Seattle, Washington is played by Los Angeles. David eventually makes it to his biology class, where we learn that he's a smart kid but an academic underachiever. After mouthing off to his teacher, he's sent to the principal's office, where he steals the current password to the school district's computer system. After school, he flirts with Jennifer, a pretty classmate played by future Brat Packer Ali Sheedy, who is at the start of a hot streak of starring roles in 80s films that would include Oxford Blues, Bad Boys, The Breakfast Club, and St. Elmo's Fire. In his bedroom, David shows Jennifer how he can use his computer to break into the school system and change their failing biology grades. The early 1980s computer technology in WarGames makes me very, very happy. David uses an IMSI 8080 computer with a drive that uses 8-inch floppy disks. Not 5 1/4, not 3 1/2, but 8-inch disks. In these Wild West days before public internet providers, he also uses an acoustic coupler with his telephone handset to dial into other computer systems, which makes me incurably nostalgic. If you're from the era where you remember doing things like storing computer data on cassette tapes, WarGames will probably resonate with you. We meet David's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lightman, played by William Bogert and Susan Davis, who don't seem to have much in common with their brilliant yet scatterbrained son. David leafs through a catalog of upcoming games from a computer company named Protovision in Sunnydale, California, and decides to see if he can hack into it to access the games prior to release. David calls directory assistance and asks for all the telephone prefixes in Sunnydale. He then sets up his modem to systematically dial every single phone number within those prefixes to see if he can connect with other computer systems. Because of WarGames, this tactic is now known as war dialing. While looking for Protovision, he accidentally manages to access Pan Am's flight reservation system, and while showing off for Jennifer, he makes a reservation for 2 on a flight to Paris. He also reaches an unidentified computer, which he suspects belongs to Protovision. When he asks about games, the computer presents him with a long list of tactical games, starting with chess and checkers and something called Falcon's Maze, and ending with global thermonuclear war. David is unable to log into the system to play those games, but his interest is piqued. He heads to the University of Washington Computer Lab to ask for help from a pair of hacker friends. Jim, played by Maury Shaken, who starred as famed fictional detective Nero Wolfe on a well-received series on A&E, and Melvin, played by Eddie Deason, who was Eugene in Greece. They confirm David's growing suspicion that the system he's trying to access is probably military, not a game company. They suggest he look for a programmer-created backdoor that will enable him to log into it. David researches the name Falcon from the Falcon's Maze computer game and deduces it's a reference to a legendary computer programmer named Stephen Falcon who died several years ago. There's a great montage montage of David conducting old-school library research involving card catalogs and bound volumes of magazine back issues and dot matrix printers. And I swear, kids today do not understand how much easier the internet has made big research projects. David and Jennifer watch a documentary on Falcon in which they learn that his beloved son Joshua died tragically young. Jennifer guesses correctly that Falcon's backdoor password into his computer system is Joshua. As a side note, we see in this documentary that Falcon has attached playing cards to the back of computer punch cards to teach the computer how to play card games. And while I'm not entirely sure of the logic of that, it does make me nostalgic because my mom was a computer programmer in the 60s, and when I was growing up in the 70s and the 80s, she'd have all these computer punch cards from the old IBM mainframe computers lying about, and she'd write recipes on them. She's long gone, but my sister and I still have these computer punch cards with recipes for, like, cherry nut bars written on them. It turns out David has access to the Whopper computer at NORAD, which identifies itself as Joshua, and which Falcon had programmed with the ability to learn, like our modern-day AIs. David and Jennifer access Joshua's list of games and decide to play Global Thermonuclear War. Playing as the Soviet Union, they launch a missile attack against Las Vegas and Seattle. At NORAD, everyone flies into a panic because from their radars, it sure looks like the USSR has just arbitrarily decided to nuke Las Vegas and Seattle. Just as General Behringer gets on the horn with the US president to recommend a counterstrike, David turns off his computer when his parents call him in for dinner, and everything at NORAD abruptly returns to normal. One element of WarGames that I respect is its refusal to lionize teenagers. David is obviously super smart, but at the same time, he is also breathtakingly immature and naive. The scene where David and Jennifer sit in front of the computer and drink tab and giggle over their cool new game, blissfully unaware that their actions have led the nation's top military brass to come this close to ordering a nuclear attack, is one of the most darkly comedic scenes in 80s teen films. The next day, David and Jennifer get a reality check when they see a news broadcast about how unidentified hackers almost started World War III. While David frantically tries to throw away all evidence linking him to the hack, Joshua connects itself to David's computer and tells him their game is still ongoing. Next thing you know, David gets swooped up by the FBI while he's drinking a big gulp outside a 7-Eleven. They whisk him off to NORAD, where everyone is on edge because Joshua has started up the simulation again. McKittrick suspects David is working with the Soviets, since the mysterious Pan Am reservation he made suggests he's planning on fleeing the country with an accomplice. Left unattended in McKittrick's office, David logs into his computer and tries to order Joshua to stop the global thermonuclear war simulation, but Joshua refuses. Joshua, who believes David is Stephen Falcon, mentions that Falcon has been receiving pension checks at an address on Goose Island in Oregon, which suggests Falcon is not actually dead. David is locked in NORAD's infirmary while the feds try to figure out what to do with him. He breaks out by using a cassette recorder to play back the door's security code tones to trick the electronic lock into opening, then sneaks out of NORAD with a tour group. He hitchhikes to a payphone and bypasses the coin deposit by using a pull tab from a can of beer to ground the circuit and trick the receiver into giving him a dial tone. WarGames created a generation of young hackers by showing all the cool, shady things you can do with technology plus ingenuity plus a flexible moral code. David calls Jennifer, and since he wants to locate Stephen Falcon, asks her to get him an airline ticket from Colorado to Salem, Oregon. Only because Matthew Broderick is a native New Yorker, he pronounces it Oregon, which is not a way that anyone from Seattle has ever pronounced Oregon. Jennifer meets him at the Salem airport, and they take a ferry to Goose Island, where they meet Professor Falcon, who is flying a remote-controlled pterodactyl and who is played by English stage star John Wood. The original concept for the character of Stephen Falcon was based on the brilliant theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking, though not much of that idea remains in the final film. The death of Falcon's son has turned him into a humanity-loathing recluse. He shows Jennifer and David films about the fall of the dinosaurs while celebrating the looming extinction of humanity. Despite their impassioned pleas, he refuses to help them get Joshua to end the simulation. Meanwhile, things at NORAD continue to deteriorate as everyone becomes increasingly convinced the Soviets have set in motion an actual nuclear strike. Fighter jets are scrambled, and General Behringer prepares for a counterstrike as NORAD goes to DEFCON 2. That's Defense Condition 2, the final stage before imminent nuclear war. Stuck on the island, David and Jennifer resign themselves to their doom. They make out for a while, and then Falcon picks them up in a helicopter, having changed his mind about letting humanity die in a fiery nuclear Armageddon. They race to the Cheyenne Mountain complex and get inside just before the gates close, because the base is now at DEFCON DEFCON 1. With seconds to go before Behringer advises the president to order a counterstrike, Falcon convinces McKittrick and Behringer that the Soviet missiles on the radar screens aren't real. Joshua is just running a simulation. And sure enough, after the radar show missiles striking the US, nothing happens. The missiles don't exist. However, Joshua now decides to play the game for real and begins cycling through millions of possible variations of the launch codes to find the ones that will work. Because Joshua has the capacity to learn, David instructs it to play endless games of tic-tac-toe against itself, whereupon it quickly figures out that as soon as you know the basic strategy, there's no point to playing tic-tac-toe because it will always end in a tie. Joshua extrapolates from this and runs endless simulations of nuclear attacks before reaching a similar conclusion. There is no way to win a nuclear war because every time you play, both sides lose. Since the only way to win is not to play, Joshua quits the game and calls off the launch. NORAD erupts into jubilant celebrations and manly handshakes and affectionate head pats, and the film ends before we see the part where David presumably gets imprisoned for life for hacking into NORAD and almost starting World War III. This is a terrific film. It's richly entertaining and genuinely suspenseful, and it was surprisingly influential. President Reagan watched WarGames at Camp David and discussed it with his national security advisors, which eventually led to the creation of 1984's NSDD-145, which is the first ever U.S. national security directive to safeguard against computer hacking. WarGames captured the 1980s zeitgeist surrounding nuclear proliferation and brinksmanship. Throughout the 80s, the threat of nuclear annihilation seemed very, very real, and WarGames presented a plausible enough scenario for how it might come about. As much as WarGames is a fantasy created in Hollywood, it's not like there was no cause to worry. WarGames was released in the US in June of 1983, and in September of 1983, the world almost ended when the Soviet Union's early warning system malfunctioned and erroneously reported that the US had launched 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Soviet officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, suspected it was a malfunction and violated protocol by not immediately reporting it to his superiors, which prevented a counterstrike. In an unrelated incident 2 months later, in November of 1983, the USSR mistook a US nuclear strike training exercise, codenamed Able Archer 83, for the real thing, and almost ordered a counterstrike. In hindsight, it is downright amazing that we survived 1983 without blowing ourselves to smithereens. 1983 was the year that all of our Cold War fears boiled over into mainstream entertainment. The German singer Nina had a huge hit that year with 99 Luftballons, also known as 99 Red Balloons, which is an infectious pop hit about balloons accidentally triggering global war. The TV movie The Day After, which showed the grim effects of nuclear war on a small town in Kansas, aired on ABC in November of 1983. WarGames tapped into our collective Gen X nuclear anxiety and explicitly spelled out something we were all thinking, that it was crazy that we could all die via a brand of warfare that was incapable of producing a winning side. Gen X is collectively known for our cynicism and dark nihilism, and yeah, this is why. WarGames is a very carefully made film with a solid script and great characters. Matthew Broderick would become a big star a few years later with 1986's Ferris Bueller's Day Off, but to my mind, he's never been better than he is here playing a complex and believable teen genius / screw-up. WarGames was a critical and commercial success, and it has a special place with Gen X for being among the first films to make geeks seem cool. It also has had a long-lasting pop culture impact. At a key moment in Ernest Cline's hugely popular 2011 novel Ready Player One, the protagonist has to take on the virtual identity of David Lightman and reenact the entire script of WarGames from start to finish in order to make it to the next level of a game. As I mentioned before, WarGames is responsible for inspiring a young generation of budding hackers. The world's largest hacking convention, which takes place every year in Las Vegas, is named in honor of WarGames. It's called DEFCON. Next time, I will congratulate everyone who had the brilliant idea to combine David Bowie and Muppets into the bizarre cinematic magic of Labyrinth. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you then.